Heavy rains are expected to fall in a few weeks. Aid agencies are racing to shore up flimsy shelters and stabilize shaky terrain before the monsoon season begins. The UN Refugee Agency says the work ahead is monumental, but preparations are off to a better start this year than last. Aid agencies last year had to deal with a massive influx of more than 740,000 Rohingya refugees fleeing violence and persecution in Myanmar. They arrived over a period of a few months, straining local resources and requiring vast amounts of humanitarian assistance.
China is stepping up its efforts, announcing a long-awaited plan to link up its southern Pearl River Delta into a massive hub of technology, research, finance, and innovation. The possibilities and challenges of the project are both equally challenging and promising, according to analysts. Some describe the plan as an attempt to create a megacity to rival Silicon Valley, the U.S. technology powerhouse that is home to companies such as Google, Facebook, and Apple. But while Silicon Valley has a population of 3.1 million, the Greater Bay Area will link up 9 cities together with Hong Kong and Macau, with a total population of about 70 million, and the economic heft, state media argues, to drive the Chinese economy, let alone the world.
In an effort to encourage the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, to dismantle its nuclear weapons program, the United Nations Security Council last year passed Resolution 2375, which imposes sanctions on North Korea. The United States is determined to strictly implement this resolution. Members of the UN Security Council, and by extension all UN member states, have unanimously agreed to fully enforce sanctions on North Korea, and we expect them to continue to honor those commitments, said Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, recently announced additional assistance to support achieving the goals outlined in the Bilateral Development Objectives Assistance Agreement between the U.S. and Nigerian governments, signed in 2015. $25 million will strengthen good governance by supporting state governments' efforts to bolster Nigeria's open government partnership commitments to improve transparency and fight corruption. An additional $1.5 million will support a healthier, more educated population in targeted states through the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, also known as PEPFAR, for a total of $26.5 million in additional assistance.
The authorities in the Spanish city of Barcelona say 13 people have been killed and 80 injured by a van, which deliberately drove into them at a popular tourist market. The vehicle moved at speed through Las Ramblas in the city centre, before being abandoned by the driver, who ran away. Hundreds of tourists and local people took shelter in shops and churches as police searched for suspects. Hours later, 2 of them, including a man of Moroccan origin, were arrested. Spanish media say another suspect was killed in a police shootout on the outskirts of the city. The Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, who's on his way to Barcelona, says he'll be coordinating efforts to reinforce security, while the Catalan President, Carles Puigdemont, has called for solidarity.
The enduring defeat of ISIS remains a top priority for the United States. The U.S.-led global coalition to defeat ISIS is leading stabilization efforts that consolidate military gains, restore basic essential services, and enable Syrians to voluntarily and safely return to their homes in Raqqa and other former ISIS strongholds. Assistance includes explosive hazard and rubble removal, providing clean water, rehabilitating electricity networks, and other basic necessities. Since April, the United States has elicited approximately $300 million in contributions and pledges from coalition partners to support immediate stabilization and early recovery initiatives in areas liberated from ISIS in northeast Syria.
First, though, the U.S. government has released its monthly jobs report. It's one measure of how the economy as a whole is doing. The report that just came out is for the month of September, and it was a disappointment. Economists had expected that 479,000 jobs would have been added last month. The actual number was well below half that, according to the U.S. Labor Department. It was the second month in a row that the number of jobs added to the American economy was dramatically lower than what economists predicted, and no one knows exactly why the growth in this area has slowed down. Many economists point to continued concerns about the coronavirus pandemic and the Delta variant of the disease.
Within the past few minutes, the Election Commission in Kenya has declared that Tuesday's presidential election was won by the incumbent Uhuru Kenyatta. The opposition, which has complained of fraud, has rejected the result. An opposition spokesman described the process as a masquerade. World leaders have expressed concern at the war of words between Washington and Pyongyang over North Korea's nuclear program. After President Trump said the US military was locked and loaded, North Korea accused him of driving the situation to the brink of nuclear war. Russia, China and Germany have all appealed for calm and further diplomatic efforts.
Executive Vice President of the U.S. government's Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, David Bohigian, and other U.S. government officials traveled to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia in August to promote U.S. investment in those countries. OPIC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. It mobilizes private capital to help address critical development challenges and, in doing so, advances U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities. On August 14th, the U.S. delegation met with Armenian Minister of Economic Development and Investments, 𝗙𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗀.
The Venezuelan authorities say they have suppressed what they termed a terrorist attack on an army base in the city of Valencia. 𝗙𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗃 of the governing United Socialist Party said loyal troops re-established security at the base. Officials said 7 people had been arrested and at least one of them died. Afghan officials say at least 50 people, including women and children, have been killed by militants in the northern province of 𝗬𝗏𝗄𝗏. A spokesman told the BBC that insurgents attacked security checkpoints and entered a village, killing civilians, among them women and children. He said Taliban and Islamic State fighters were involved. The Taliban has denied killing civilians. They say they killed 28 members of a local militia.
The United States has confirmed that it will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Washington has informed the United Nations, formally implementing a decision by President Trump in June. But the State Department said the US would continue to participate in climate change meetings until the withdrawal process was completed. New research indicates that weather-related disasters could kill more than 150,000 people in Europe each year by the end of the century. The European Commission report estimated that heat waves would cause 99% of all weather-related deaths on the continent.
President Trump has reluctantly signed into law a congressional bill imposing sanctions on Russia over its policy in Ukraine and alleged meddling in last year's US presidential election. Afterwards, he called the legislation seriously flawed, saying it encroached on his powers to negotiate foreign policy and hurt the interests of European allies. The company that provided the Venezuelan voting system for the controversial Constituent Assembly elections says the turnout figure was inflated by at least 1 million. The Speaker of the opposition-controlled National Assembly called on prosecutors to open a criminal investigation immediately.
In 1945, while in a state of exhaustion, the mathematician John von Neumann had a kind of stammering premonition. He was in Los Alamos working on the atom bomb, and he told his wife Clary that the energy source he was helping to develop would make scientists the most hated and also the most wanted citizens of any country. Then he informed her that his other ongoing project, the computer, would one day be even more important and potentially even more dangerous. Good biographies of some of the greatest mathematical minds are rare. Because they were polymaths, biographers who can interpret their manifold achievements for the ordinary mortal are themselves thin on the ground. This has been von Neumann's fate, and the upshot is that he has not had the recognition he deserves.
High staff churn is here to stay. Retention strategies require a rethink.
In the not-so-distant past, bosses did not have to worry as much about their workforces. Newcomers could absorb the corporate culture osmotically. Workers' families were invisible, not constantly interrupting Zoom calls. Employees had a job, not a voice. Now firms have to be intentional. Management speak for thinking about everything from the point of the office to how staff communicate with each other. Retention is the latest area to require attention. The spike in staff departures, known as the Great Resignation, is centred on America. A record 3% of the workforce there quit their jobs in September.
Even if the distribution of women's occupations matched that of men, if women were the doctors and men were the nurses, she calculates that at most a third of the pay gap would disappear. The most important cause is that women curtail their careers as a part of a rational household response to labour markets, which generously reward anyone, male or female, who is willing to hold down what Ms. Goldin calls a greedy job. These are roles such as those in law, accountancy and finance that demand long and unpredictable hours. Parents need somebody to be on call at home in case a child falls ill and needs picking up from school, or needs cheering on at a concert or football match.
On August 4th, explosives aboard 2 drones flying near Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro as he spoke in Caracas were detonated. 7 people were injured. Maduro has used the incident as a pretext to crack down on Venezuela's opposition by unleashing the regime's secret police. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said the United States condemns the political violence that occurred on August 4th and urges the Maduro regime to respect the rule of law, exercise restraint, and safeguard the presumption of innocence for all accused.
Like every farmer, Courtney Hammond, who grows blueberries and cranberries in Washington County, Maine, has a lot of worries. He frets about weather, invasive species, failed crops, and global prices. To abide by federal food safety laws, he has had to do training, maintain meticulous records, have insect and rodent control plans, and document daily the sanitation of his processing equipment. It is a tremendous amount of work, but it means, he says, I don't have to worry about anybody getting sick from eating anything that leaves my farm. Now he is worried that a new law may put his hard work in jeopardy. Earlier this month, 61% of voters opted to change the state constitution to ensure that all Mainers had a right to food, first law of its kind in America.
The lives of distinguished people often take a lot of telling, yet even devotees might raise an eyebrow at the heft of 𝗙𝗿𝗏 memoir, 2 volumes totalling 960 pages. Casual Beatles fans may be surprised by the title too, though most would consider 𝗙𝗍𝗏 the band's best musician, with an honourable mention for George Harrison. John Lennon typically gets the plaudits for writing. In a poll by the BBC in 2001 to rank the greatest lyricists, Lennon received more than twice as many votes as McCartney.
European market is a tough terrain for food delivery firms. Delivery Hero has had a good run in the past couple of years. In August 2020, it ascended to the DAX, the stock market index of Germany's most valuable listed firms. It is present in 50 countries on 4 continents. Revenue for the third quarter was €1.8 billion, that's $2 billion, a jump of 89% compared with the same period in 2020. We grew 100% before Corona, 100% during Corona, and we will grow 100% after Corona, says Niclas Ostberg, the Berlin-based firm's Swedish chief executive. By numbers of orders, Delivery Hero is more than twice as big as DoorDash, its large American rival.
It might sound obvious that if you want to improve a robot's software, you should improve its software. Agrim Gupta of Stanford University, however, begs to differ. He thinks you can also improve a robot's software by improving its hardware. That is, by letting the hardware adapt itself to the software's capabilities. As they describe in Nature Communications, he and his colleagues have devised a way of testing this idea. In doing so, they have brought to robotics the principles of evolution by natural selection. They've also cast the spotlight on an evolutionary idea that dates from the 1890s, but which has hitherto proved hard to demonstrate.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the first part of its latest assessment report, The Earth is Warming. Even with a drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, temperatures will probably be 1.5 degrees Celsius above their late 19th century levels by 2050. Climate change is underway, the report laments, with all the environmental consequences that brings. The extent of the damage depends on the cumulative build-up of emissions and can be limited if the world strives for net zero carbon emissions.
The Democratic Republic of the Congo will hold an election in December, hopefully leading to a peaceful democratic transfer of power for the first time in the country's history. Sitting President Joseph Kabila came to power in 2001, having succeeded his father, Laurent Désiré Kabila, after his assassination. Joseph Kabila was elected president in 2006 for a 5-year term and re-elected in 2011. Though his second term ended in 2016 and the DRC constitution prevents him from seeking a third term, elections were not held and Kabila remained in power.
On the face of things, it seems both absurd and unfair that large American companies regularly whittle down their tax bills, taking advantage of every loophole on offer. One study found that at least 55 big companies incurred no federal taxes at all on their profits in 2020. A proposal being discussed as The Economist went to press and as the Democratic Party scrambled to fund its social spending package seems to offer a popular solution, a minimum tax on corporate earnings as reported to shareholders, rather than as massaged down when reported to tax collectors.
A hormone called relaxin helps loosen up pregnant women's hips. Without it, the pain of delivery would be unbearable. Its job done, however, relaxin lingers in female bodies for up to a year, when softer ligaments make new mothers more prone to injury, as Jessica Ennis-Hill, an Olympic champion heptathlete, discovered in training after giving birth in 2014. 5 years later, Dame Jessica started Jenis, a fitness app to help other women perform safe postnatal workouts. It now lets users optimize workouts for the different phases of their menstrual cycles and has just concluded a successful funding round.
It was another roller coaster week for energy prices. After OPEC and its allies resisted calls to increase output, the price of Brent crude surpassed $80 per barrel and reached its highest level in 3 years. The cartel said it would stick to the gradual increases in output it agreed to over the summer. The energy shortage rattled other financial markets too, as investors worried about the fallout. In America and Europe, government bond yields climbed. In Britain, the yield on 10-year gilts jumped to its highest since May 2019.
First it was pets, then fish. Now it's poultry and pigs. The list of animals allowed to feed on insects is growing. A new EU law authorising the use of insect protein in poultry and pig feed came into force earlier this month, a significant milestone for an industry keen to worm its way into the animal feed business. Since a ban on processed animal protein was imposed in 2001 in the wake of the mad cow crisis, soy and fish meal have become the bedrock of animal feed in Europe.
Carbon-rich soil is dark, crumbly and fertile and retains some water. But erosion can occur if soil is dry, which is a likely effect if it contains inadequate amounts of carbon. Erosion is of course bad for people trying to grow crops or breed animals on that terrain. In the 1970s and 80s, Lau was studying soils in Africa, so devoid of organic matter that the ground had become extremely hard, like cement. There he met a pioneer in the study of global warming, who suggested that carbon from the soil had moved into the atmosphere. This is now looking increasingly likely.
So the phone company designed phones for use globally with this added feature. ethnographic research has also been carried out in computer companies. In one company, IT systems administrators were observed for several weeks. It was found that a large amount of their work involved communicating with colleagues in order to solve problems, but that they didn't have a standard way of exchanging information from spreadsheets and so on. So, the team came up with an idea for software that would help them to do this.
It took us months and months of toil to sequence a single viral genome. Now people can do that in a matter of hours. And the rate at which people have been able to sort of make progress on understanding SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is just spectacular.
Rice spoke this morning on a web press conference from Rockefeller University.
So I think it's taught us a lot of things about science in general. If there's really a pressing problem, we sort of mobilize people all around the world to sort of work on these problems. Really, great progress can be made. People would love to have a cure in a week or a vaccine in a week. I mean, that's not feasible. But the speed with which good therapeutics and vaccines will be developed for SARS-CoV-2 to prevent COVID-19 is going to be spectacular. I guess we're sort of in the middle of a major virology education.
Charles Rice of the Rockefeller University in New York City.
I think that the field has definitely changed since the days when I was a graduate student, and I think one of the things that is very reassuring now is really the global response to this pandemic in the sort of academic and clinical and sort of pharma communities. The rate of progress.
Earlier today, October 5th, 2020, Rice was informed that he had won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the virus that causes hepatitis C. The identification of the virus has led to tests and treatments for the condition. Rice shared the prize with 𝗙𝗵𝗋𝗄 of the National Institutes of Health and Michael Houghton of the University of Alberta.
The findings suggest that the last ice age was significantly colder than scientists thought, and that matters today.
The reason that we want to know how cold the last ice age is, beyond the fact that it's just a cool thing to know, is that we can actually use it to understand a quantity called climate sensitivity.
Climate sensitivity is a measure of how much the planet warms in response to rising greenhouse gases. In this long ago case, we know how much carbon dioxide concentrations increased between the last ice age and pre-industrial period from air bubbles trapped in ancient ice. And now we have Tierney's new results on the temperature difference between glacial and interglacial conditions. Together, these data suggest that low-end estimates of climate sensitivity, in which greenhouse gases don't cause much warming, are unlikely to be correct.
If we had low climate sensitivity, then we would be less worried about, what all the CO2 emissions are going to do. And so we can kind of rule that possibility out. I suppose that's not great news. So we obviously don't have thermometers in the glacial period, so we have to instead look for these kinds of stand-in indicators.
One kind of stand-in is plankton that lived in the ocean and got preserved in marine sediments. Scientists use these fossils to infer past ocean temperatures by studying changes in the chemistry of their shells and in the kinds of fats and other compounds they produced. Tierney and her team then combined these data with a climate model to give a full picture of glacial conditions.
It's actually a technique used every day in weather forecasting. What's new is we're using it for the past, not the future, so we're actually, hindcasting, if you will, rather than forecasting.
The study is in the journal Nature. How much colder was it at the peak of the last ice age? That's a question scientists have been trying to answer for decades. And now they have a new best guess, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot, especially considering it's a global average. Parts of North America were much colder.
First of all, large areas of the Northeast were completely under ice, so that would have been pretty chilly. You wouldn't be living there. But even here in the West, right, where we weren't covered by an ice sheet, it would have been something like 20 degrees Fahrenheit lower.
Jessica Tierney, a paleoclimatologist at the University of Arizona. Tierney and her colleagues spent years compiling information about Earth's climate at the height of the last glacial period, about 20,000 years ago.
Think of the sun as the center of a vinyl record, with the planets strung out along the grooves. In contrast, 𝗍's team discovered that the stars in this triple star system are ringed by clouds of dust in multiple warped and misaligned planes. Picture a three-dimensional gyroscope rather than a two-dimensional vinyl record. The observations are in the journal Science. Those rings of dust will presumably go on to form planets as the star system matures, and 𝗍 says astronomers have indeed observed other more mature star systems with planets orbiting in these misaligned planes.
And we wanted to understand if that happens at the time those planets were born, or it is some evolutionary thing over, a billion years.
The findings suggest that weirdly aligned planetary systems are born that way, and that stars and their embryonic planets can be all topsy-turvy, even in their infancy.
Yeah, it's really, really young. Yeah, it's a baby.
𝗍 says if you translate that million-year lifespan to that of a human, it's the equivalent of a week-old baby. And how many week-old babies do you bump into?
If you just walk around your neighborhood, there's really little chance that you meet a baby who is 1 week old, right? So first of all, it's hard to find these systems. They are pretty rare.
𝗍 and his colleagues got lucky spotting this one. Using radio telescopes, they were able to image the star system, and they say it differs from our own solar system in more than just star count. In our solar system, for example, all 8 planets orbit the sun more or less in a single plane. Our solar system is far from the only way to put together stars and their planets.
If you look at all the stars in our galaxy, in the Milky Way, right, more than a half of the stars are formed in multipoles, meaning that there are more than one star in a system.
Astrophysicist 𝗂𝗍𝗶 of the Carnegie Institution for Science. He has studied one of those systems with 3 stars. It's called GW Orionis, and it's freshly formed, only 1 million years old. When restaurants first shut down early in the pandemic, Americans raided grocery stores. They started cooking more at home and presumably generating more leftovers. Those leftovers can be a convenient future meal, but they've also got a dark side.
There's a tendency that if you put an item on the plate that's a leftover, there's a higher probability that you're not going to fully consume that item, and so it's probably going to go to waste.
Brian Rowe, an applied economist at The Ohio State University. He and his colleagues recently studied leftovers and food waste by tracking the eating habits of 18 men and women in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The findings are in the journal PLOS ONE. Overall, Rose says one bigger lesson emerged on how to avoid scraping perfectly good food into the trash.
So for us, the real take-home here was choose a smaller meal and you're less likely to generate leftovers. And that's a good thing because leftovers, all else equal, tend to be wasted more often.
Not that Roe doesn't have a few aspirational Tupperware sitting around.
I'm guilty of this as well. We have stuff left over from last Thanksgiving sitting around in our freezer. And I know people who have moved with frozen items before, never getting around to actually eating.
The study is in the journal Nature Communications. In the future, Darcy says, a brick wall could potentially serve a dual purpose, providing structural support and storing electricity generated from renewable energy sources like solar panels. The technology is still at least a few years away from being ready for the commercial market. Right now, the energy storage capacity of the bricks is still pretty low, about 1% of a lithium-ion battery. The team is now testing ways to improve brick performance, because it looks like you can teach an old brick new tricks.
The participants tracked what they ate using an iPhone app, and during the week-long study, the study subjects collectively piled 1,200 different foods on their plates. After analyzing what got eaten, saved, or thrown away, the researchers found that leftovers were more likely to be picked at and not fully eaten, which is a finding we can all probably identify with. But they also observed that leftovers, perhaps due to being older and less fresh, directed diners' attention to the other, more novel items on their plate, which brings up an interesting possible strategy to get people to eat their veggies.
Yeah, I guess if you have an item that you don't normally eat as much of and you're trying to get people to eat their peas, perhaps surrounding it with leftovers is a way to make them focus on the newest item on the plate.
I love the idea of adding value to things that are inexpensive, things that are affordable, things that we kind of take for granted.
Julio Darcy is an assistant professor of chemistry at Washington University and one of the researchers on the project. The brick battery relies on the reddish pigment known as iron oxide, or rust, that gives red bricks their color. The scientists pumped the bricks with several gases that react with iron oxide to produce a network of plastic fibers. These microscopic fibers coat the empty spaces inside the bricks and conduct electricity.
What we're trying to do is we're trying to make specialized plastics that are only used in the nanoscale, where we use very little of the plastic, and we can actually embed that plastic inside construction materials that can store energy.
Valentina Gomez-Baumann is an evolutionary biologist and ornithologist at the Field Museum in Chicago. She and her team have now observed that non-vocal sound production phenomenon in another type of bird, the fork-tailed flycatcher. The researchers studied 2 groups of the birds in South America and recorded the birds making these fluttering sounds with their wings during morning courtship rituals and in combat between males. One of the 2 flycatcher subspecies is migratory, the other stays put. And by carefully measuring the bird's feathers, the research team found that the migratory birds had longer, thinner feathers, presumably for some aerodynamic advantage. But that altered feather shape also meant the bird's fluttering produced a different frequency. Compare the migratory bird's flutter to the stationary bird's.
Bricks are one of the oldest known building materials, dating back thousands of years. But researchers at Washington University in St. Louis have found a new use for bricks as energy storage units. A team of engineers and chemists have found a way to transform an ordinary house brick into a pseudo-battery, allowing it to conduct and store electricity. The bricks are powerful enough to illuminate an LED light bulb and cost only about $3 to make.
Charles Darwin is most famous for his finches, from whose beaks he gleaned the idea that a single species might radiate into many. But he studied other attributes of birds too, like the rhythmic sounds some species made during courtship by fluttering, shaking, or rattling their feathers together.
Since Darwin, there has been this fact that birds produce sounds with wings and tails or flight feathers. So there are species of manakins that do these sounds, and there's hummingbirds that do the sounds.
And that's something we'd love to examine, whether, the local ecosystem and the associated organisms with the sloth, perhaps that changes. A lot of organisms can't readily change their day-to-night activity. Their survival strategies based on one or the other. And so it may well be that change or that association with daytime as opposed to nighttime or ephemerality does change some of the organisms that associate with it.
Duffield's most important piece of equipment for this research may be a comfortable chair.
because a lot of the literature that we'd reviewed that associated with sloths had examined only a partial 24 hours. And so there were some inferences about their activity profiles over the course of the entire 24-hour period. So there was a bit of guesswork there.
Duffield believes that because predators in the Atlantic forest are extinct and sloths don't have to compete with other species for resources, they've simply taken on a daytime or diurnal schedule.
The light-dark cycle would be that primary cue, and that's what's kind of surprising, that an animal could be nocturnal under some conditions and diurnal under the other.
Other organisms may come along for the slow ride, from the algae that live on sloth's fur to the insects that live alongside the unhurried mammals. Duffield says it's not clear if the new schedule adopted by sloths in the Atlantic forests also affects these creatures.
And this would have made it more vulnerable to the top predators of the time, which were cousins of T-Rex. But we actually don't think that it's the cancer that killed this animal, even though if it were allowed to run its course, it certainly would have been fatal.
The tumorous bone was discovered among thousands of other bones from the same species. All these animals appeared to have died in a coastal flood.
And this flood looks like it killed a herd of these horned dinosaurs, Centrosaurus, which are known for living in large social groups. And we suspect, although we can't prove, that the cancer could get to such an advanced state because this animal was able to benefit from the safety and numbers of being in a herd. Whereas if it was out on its own with this devastating disease, it certainly would have had a good chance of being picked off before the cancer progressed this far.
According to new research published in the journal Mammalian Biology by Duffield and colleagues, sloths are responding to that habitat disturbance by altering their biological rhythms.
We started to see that the sloths were primarily day active, and that's counterintuitive from some of the literature on the species that we came across before that suggested that they showed ephemeral activity, which is kind of neither day nor night, just kind of across the whole board. And in a few studies, it was predominantly nocturnal behavior. So this was kind of the opposite to what we'd expected.
Duffield says there are few, if any, studies where researchers monitored sloths over a full 24-hour period. This study did exactly that for 29 days.
And out of the hundreds of dinosaur bones that we looked at, we found one that was a candidate for bone cancer.
The bone specimen Evans and his colleagues found comes from a dinosaur that roamed Western Canada between 70 and 75 million years ago. The creature is called a Centrosaurus.
Centrosaurus is a horned dinosaur. It's about the size of a rhinoceros, and it's a close cousin of the famous Triceratops. So it looked very similar. It would have had a parrot-like beak at the end of its large skull, had a neck shield similar to Triceratops, and walked around on 4 feet and eat plants.
It's apparent cancer is a particularly aggressive type. But Duffield and colleagues now collect data on the brown-throated three-toed sloth in the Atlantic forest. Duffield says the sloths can stay in sight, or even in the same tree, for nearly 24 hours. The animals are at rest anywhere from 75 to 90% of the time. But they're coping with a damaged ecosystem.
The suggestion is 98% of that forest has been depleted. There's a lot of human disturbance. There's obviously roads cutting through these areas of the forest, and it means the population of fauna and flora is depleted.
Given that hundreds of thousands of dinosaur bones have been dug up, is there any evidence that dinosaurs got cancer?
David Evans, senior curator of paleontology at the Royal Museum of Ontario in Toronto.
There had been a few studies that had kind of suggested, based on just like gross anatomy, that dinosaurs might have gotten cancer, but there was nothing compelling from a medical standpoint. And from that point on, we decided to go on a hunt for rare dinosaur diseases, in particular cancer.
So in 2017, Evans and colleagues went digging through a collection of dinosaur bones at the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Alberta, a hotbed of dinosaur fossils. Somewhere in this forest, you hear, there are sloths. Those sloths live in Brazil's Atlantic forest. If you're a tourist, watching sloths isn't that exciting. But if you're a scientist, well, it's also not that exciting. But there's a big upside.
And so they're actually a great study animal for the wild, because you can collect a lot of data on them.
Giles Duffield, a biologist at the University of Notre Dame who studies circadian rhythms.
I mean, the ecology work that I used to do several years back in Bolivia was focused on bird conservation and bird ecology. And, you know, you'd see some parrots and you'd make some notes and then they were gone. You wouldn't see them again for another 24 hours.
The results appear in the journal Nature. Ultimately, it's up to us how much ice actually melts.
Humanity has the knob, the carbon knob, and that knob is going to influence the rates of ice loss from the Greenland ice sheet.
If the world goes net carbon zero by 2100, for example, Briner says ice loss could stop entirely at the end of the century, according to one model.
That was what kept me from being completely depressed about our study.
Dozens of countries have already announced goals to go net zero by the middle of this century. So far, the U.S. is not one of them.
You can already see how powerful it's going to be to have an app have multiple instances or multiple copies of itself running. And so that's pretty neat. I'm still trying to wrap my head around of like, okay, I have like notes open in 4 different places and where's the one that I want? And that I think will just take some time getting used to. I think it's a very powerful system they've built. I don't know how intuitive all of it is, but I think we will kind of figure it out with time. But I'm immediately impressed with Safari. The first thing I did was go to my local bank. Their website just doesn't work on iOS Safari in the past. And they have like a really bad iPhone app. It's not full screen on the iPhone 10 and it's kind of janky and old. And the first thing I did was I loaded that website up in Safari on iPadOS and it all just worked just the way they said it would. And that really impressed me that all of a sudden the browser, it feels like a real browser now and not sort of what we've been used to on the iPad where the iPad gets
we're not here saying this is the newest, most horrible threat to freshwater turtles. It's probably still the case that loss of habitat, introduced predators, overexploitation, those are the big threats to freshwater turtles. But it might very well be that ingestion of plastics and other litter is a big threat for some species and for some populations. We don't know. But given that turtles are really having a rough go of it right now. I mean, this is the most threatened group of vertebrates. 61% of all turtle species are threatened or have gone extinct in historic times. Like it's a rough time to be a turtle on this planet.
Pauly and his colleagues call on biologists to devote some of their attention to this understudied topic. And regular people can do their part as well, especially with all the single-use PPE we've all been wearing throughout the pandemic, like the nitrile glove pieces Pauly found inside one of the turtles.
Something external drive?
Yeah, so I had it on a 12-inch MacBook, the first generation 12-inch MacBook, and I sort of gave up on that. That machine is slow, and with a beta Mac OS on it was really struggling, and so I moved it to an external SSD, and I'm booting my 15-inch MacBook Pro from it, and doing that. And then my iPad Pro, just yesterday I put the iPad OS public beta on it, and I really like the features. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in iPad OS, but it's pretty rough around the edges.
The results were published in the journal Scientific Reports.
There's not this awareness that freshwater turtles have this potential threat of plastic ingestion. And one of the big goals that we have with our paper is just trying to get increased awareness that plastic ingestion is potentially a big issue for freshwater turtles, and that if a researcher comes across a dead turtle or a veterinarian is presented with a dead turtle, that it's an opportunity to then examine those animals to see whether plastic ingestion is much more common than we currently think.
If there's good news, it's that none of the turtles that Polly's team examined seemed to have suffered from swallowing the litter. They all appeared to be in good health.
And especially Catalina have. This feels like a bigger delta between the previous OS and this one, and that means more bugs in the beginning. So, we'll see how it pans out. I would expect that we will see developer beta 3 and public beta 2 probably next week, and hopefully it's smoother sailing from here on out.
Yeah, that would be good. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll release the developer beta and wait to see if there are any major show-stopping issues, and then that version the next week becomes a public beta.
Or even a couple days later on occasion. They have tinkered with that timing over the years, and I wait for the public beta because the developer beta, they can be rougher, and there have been times in the past where the public beta is like every other developer release. I mean, Apple has tweaked this endlessly. And so I kind of do the public beta in my mind. Maybe I think that's a little bit more stable, but of course that may or may not be true. But yeah, I think at this point, if you're looking at that public beta page, I'd maybe wait to the next one and see how that feels. Because I'm telling you right now, this is not something you want on your carry phone right now.
Yeah.
As conservationists remove red-eared sliders from natural ecosystems, researchers like Polly can study them as proxies for native species. By seeing how much plastic the red-eared sliders from the UC Davis Arboretum are swallowing, he can get an idea for how much plastic the native western pond turtles may be ingesting as well. The researchers found bits of plastic in 5 of 65 turtles, or 8%. They used a technique called Raman spectroscopy to confirm that it really was plastic and not, say, bits of crayfish exoskeletons.
And that's what allowed us to determine that one of the plastics was a nitrile glove.
They also identified bits of plastic shopping bags and chunks of plastic cutlery.
who is steeped in this stuff that that's not the developer's fault. I mean,
no, they literally didn't know until 3 weeks ago that this thing existed.
And if you build against iOS 13 or try to include fixes for iOS 13, that can be sort of tricky getting through app review, and you may not be able to do it because it causes trouble for iOS 12, where 98% of their customers are. So I don't envy that frustration on the part of third-party developers, but Apple saw what was going on in the App Store, people leaving bad reviews like, oh, it crashes on the beta. And Apple, I think, sort of took responsibility for that and said, look, you're not going to be able to leave these reviews because you have decided to put beta software on your device. And so I don't know really where that line is, but this year I feel very acutely that that's something worth discussing.
Freshwater turtles around the world are declining. And so you're not, researchers aren't going out and euthanizing turtles and putting them into museum collections on a regular basis. We do that for lots of other species, but people aren't going to be doing it for turtles because it's just not the right thing to do from a conservation perspective.
Red-eared sliders are native to the southern US and northern Mexico, but because they're so popular in the pet trade, they've become invasive on every continent except for Antarctica.